Hi Divas, welcome back to the Substack Adjacent podcast where we talk about beauty, culture, and storytelling. I'm your host, Mila, a journalist and aspiring filmmaker with a penchant for beauty and fashion. Without further ado, let's get into today's topic. But first, a little tidbit about what's going on right now. Now, this topic was inspired by two different things. Well, bonus, also the Substack article that I wrote about it. That was a nice, cute 5-minute short read. But it was inspired by mainly two things. Number one, my frustration with just wanting a happy fairy tale love story. And then two, feeling very poor. Keeping in mind that there is a difference between feeling it and being poor, but I was thinking a lot about the American dream, like from the 50s, and how much discourse there is about the American dream now. And how supposedly people like to argue that Cinderella, a very hyper-feminine, female-presenting character, is depicted as the epitome of what the American dream is supposed to be. And I think about how I want to pinpoint one specific aspect of the old American dream, and that was women's authentic inclusion in it. How I believe Cinderella is not actually a good representation of the American dream as we think, at least the old American dream, because now the new American dream involves the internet, influencers, content creators, and women entering the workforce. So I'd have to wonder, I'd have to argue on my Substack, if Ken was the accessory to the Barbieverse, perhaps women were the accessory to the American dream made by men, a narrative made by men. I mean, like, women were totally accessories in the 1950s, like, idealistic American dream. Like, it's the white picket fence, popping out 2 babies unmedicated, making things with Jell-O, and making a martini for your husband before he gets home so then you could have time to put your head in the oven. You know, classic things. And I don't drink, but this topic kind of makes me want to, so I'd like to change the subject just a smidge. And I want to get into the table of context for this episode. Number one, why people think Cinderella was a good representation of the American dream. 2, why it's not. 3, is it because the dream changed? Because women maybe entered the workforce? Next, is it why the majority of influencers we love are women? And last but not least, what being on social media or being a social media mogul has to do with the new idealistic version of the American dream. And soon we will ask our final question. Is Cinderella a good representation of the American dream in my perspective, in our perspective as a collective, or was she just an influencer in the making? I really hope this doesn't become cheesy, since Cinderella is one of my favorite stories of all time. And I'm not talking about like the princess, I'm talking about the trope, which I will turn to time and time again because we now see book publisher giants admitting that they don't think that a love story or a romance book needs to have a happy ending, which I go, no, I need a happy ending. With this political climate, girl, I need to make sure that my book has a happy ending, that they live happily ever after, if you catch my drift. Now, to start this off, I thought I'd give us a little pop quiz. Ooh. And I want to talk about specifically this question. How does the American dream or Cinderella represent how, with circumstances out of our control, we were able to rise up with A, luck, B, perseverance, C, kindness, or D, someone important knowing our worth, aka feeling safe, being seen? The answer, in my opinion, is all of them. But I think we should start from the beginning before we start talking about the American dream and how the American dream was coined, like who first used the concept of the American dream. And I'd rather start from the beginning, the Brothers Grimm, which is a dark and contrary to popular belief, was actually not written by the Brothers Grimm. Rather, they collected a bunch of stories across Europe through time and time again that actually traditionally have very pagan origins. And of course, the Grimms, they were not Grimm, they were also Christian, so they did change a lot of the subtext. Like, for example, with Rapunzel, in the original story, there was a lot of hidden subtext that, you know, Rapunzel's birth mother wanted to have an abortion. But it was changed to a different plot line because the Brothers Grimm didn't like that. But then again, I did learn that in Catholic school. So I'm going to take this perspective and this narrative idealistic representation with a grain of salt. Definitely this unedited version will have to be on Substack. Exclusively, I will have to make a YouTube version of this for sure with the language that I'm going to be using. But I argue that the retellings were empowering because they show that women as flawed and empowered and selfish. But they were highlighting a pious perspective of what a woman was supposed to be, in the sense where this is the perfect representation of since the dawn of history in literature, in the Bible, in religious subtext, that usually being dominated by men as the main narrator, in a sense where it means that men created narrative for so long that if women were barred from reading and writing, then the people who determined history would always perhaps lean towards a certain perspective, the male perspective. I believe that men only need a century and a major, and they can just do whatever they want and dilly-dally across time and space and goof off in the internal timeline. But I want to get into this pious representation of what a successful woman is supposed to be, which I think also is a really big topic point of what American dream or the American dream was supposed to look like for women if we were to determine that they weren't going to be a accessory. Rather, I would want to argue that because of the Brothers Grimm Christian subtext, they were not just erasing Eastern European culture in the process, but they were also setting up a multitude of fairy tales that were teaching women what empowerment can be. But they were also teaching women that being selfish, being guilt, feeling remorse, or in some way, I don't know how to describe it. Like, think of the trope of the evil stepmother. It makes me think that the Brothers Grimm had mommy issues for sure. And I'm surprised nobody talks about this. The Brothers Grimm, I feel like, definitely had mother issues, mommy issues. Because what is with the whole evil stepmother nonsense and then having the pious, perfect, beautiful woman be the one who gets the happy ending, when this other person was widowed and is sad and cranky and probably going through menopause? I think it's just another way of us villainizing aging women. Story for another time, because I'd love to analyze storytelling as the ultimate trope to bringing people together and tearing people apart. That's also my perspective as a communications major and an aspiring storyteller, where I know for a fact that through an intersectional approach, we can hopefully tell stories that are meaningful, that have meaningful perspectives, and that make people feel seen and heard and respected and happy, while also being educational for other people to open up perspectives. And that's why it's important that when I go about my topics, I talk about stuff like this. We are now living in a world, supposedly according to most independent women, that men aren't needed, so they have to cope with wanting to just be wanted. And when this original narrative was being built to empower as the seeker of their own destiny, which brings us to the American dream, circa 1950 something or whatever. So, the term American dream was actually coined and popularized by writer and historian James Truslow Adams in his 1931 bestseller, The Epic of America. He defined it as a society where every individual, regardless of birth or background, had the opportunity to reach their fullest innate potential. Rather than merely being about material wealth, Adams envisioned it as an irregulatory dream of better, richer, and fuller life for someone. The Epic of America is a comprehensive single-volume history of the United States from Christopher Columbus to the Great Depression. James Truslow Adams wrote it to show how ordinary people shaped the nation rather than just focusing on presidents and wars. Despite what others interpret the American dream as now, the original interpretation or the original coin of the American dream was heavily anti-materialistic. So how did we get from here to then the white picket fence, martinis, and a golden retriever and 3 cars in the driveway? Let's first talk about Adams' official perspective on the American dream, like what he envisioned it as being. Well, first off, it was inherently not the pursuit of material wealth, but also a social ideal of genuine equality in a sense of like 1900s equality of self-fulfillment. It was anti-materialistic. He explicitly stated many times that the dream was not about motor cars and highways or high wages. It's innate potential. It was about innate potential. He defined it as a land where each person could reach their full capabilities without the barriers of entry that are being left through systemic oppression. It is about social order. He envisioned how a society where people could be recognized for their intrinsic worth, regardless of birth or position. You see where this is going? And the mutual benefits, he believed that the dream required citizens to work together for the common good, not just for individual profit. Now, I know what you're thinking. Just like teachers, being a royal, taxpayers will pay your salary. So, if you really think about it, when I really look at Cinderella, she actually does not represent the materialistic version of the American dream, but rather the thought of social order, innate potential, and mutual benefit, where you inherently know someone's worth regardless of birth or position, and they are able to rise up. It is not just a rags and riches story, it is a manifestation story, which I think is really interesting how manifestation plays a pivotal role in what the American dream can look like now, because it goes beyond perseverance. Oh my gosh, my contour is so terrible. Anyway, it goes beyond the original aspect of perseverance, because he is also quoted in his book, which perfectly segues into things like influencers and the contradictories, and also creative people as a whole and their role in the American dream. The quote says, "The great value of life is suspended on someone with he said that the great value of life is to spend it on something that will outlast it." James Truslow Adams. He shifts from Adams, and as we shift from Adams' anti-materialistic vision to the white picket fence ideal, represented in major commercialization of the original concept, we see why the anti-materialistic dream shifted. That has to do with post-World War II consumerism boom, where economic policies shifted in favor of manufacturing in America, suburban home ownership, and consumer goods. And the picket fence metric was tied directly to visible assets like cars and appliances, which completely replaces Adam's focus on the innate capability, where basically we have this tie between masculinity, economics, capitalism, and legitimacy, where your success is only legitimate if we can see it through wealth obtained through these means. And that also has to do with Cold War propaganda, where because of this patriarchal duty, it directly ties to what personal fulfillment is supposed to look like, which is inherently tied to patriotism. And corporate advertising also plays a pivotal role, where they want you to feel richer than life itself, and basically makes it where you feel like you need to have a checklist of goods and services on your repertoire. Now, how have women been left out of this occasion? The domesticity trap. The traditional suburban ideal required women to sacrifice personal and professional development to maintain the domestic sphere. We started off in the 40s and 30s where men were at war and women entered the workforce to help with the war efforts. And then men came back in the 50s. We were all forced to go back into home and do these traditional gender roles. And then by the 60s and 70s, we were fed up to the point where in the 80s, around 50% of majority-ish of women were entering the workforce, which is super interesting. But it's also the fact that for those who do work at home, as in who work in the home, as in those who are child rearing, cooking, cleaning, and wiping your husband's ass, I would say there's a really big aspect of unpaid labor, where the economic engine of the mid-century dream relied heavily on the uncompensated housewife labor that restricted true financial independence. If you're curious about a good topic like that, I recommend the recent-ish podcast episode from Manifestella, recent as of this time, talking about how stay-at-home moms are broke and what does that have to do with everything else. Because people don't realize this, but if you itemize a bill and commonly look at how much it costs for these services, to have a chef, to have an assistant, to have a nanny, to have a cleaner, basically cleaning like every after you every single second of the day, to have so many things like that, and you itemize that into an annual salary. Stay-at-home moms, if it was a job, would be paid 6 figures, but yet that's unpaid. Girl. But we also need to keep in mind that one thing that is heavily left out of the equation when it comes to women and the American dream is how class and race intersect, where the working class women and women of color are doubly excluded from systematic wage gaps and housing discrimination that locked out of complete suburban mobility. And the fact that Adam explicitly included women in his dream of achieving full intrinsic capability and the rigid domestic role are severely restricted of personal growth, showing that the itemized, capitalistic, and patriarchal narrative of the American dream goes heavily against what the American dream was supposed to be. Cinderella became the ultimate symbol of the American dream because her story reframed upward mobility as the rag to riches story, narrating into domestic, romantic reward that perfectly mirrored the mid-century expectations for women. While men pursued the dream through economic labor, women were conditioned to achieve it through marriage and domesticity. The rags to riches underdog template is about overcoming poverty and going through class mobility with all of these intrinsic values that I feel like are at stake, and all of the things that you have to fight for upwards, and all of your things and levels and things that just get in the way, basically, and all of your barriers of entry that are seemingly under discussed in this narrative. We also see marriage as a only vehicle for economic safety for women for a very long time, where we see a dependent on the success of your husband, which, let's face it, my grandfather was a baseball coach and biology teacher. My grandma was a stay-at-home mom. But also at the same time, my grandpa, even though he worked at a preparatory school, he still got paid like $37,000 a year. And as the economy changed from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s till now, that school was his life, and I don't think they gave enough of him to that school, arguably. But still then, my grandma was still not able to hold down a job for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about maybe another time. It's kind of deep stuff. But basically, when it comes to the American dream and having to rely on one single income, that's not fun. Like, I got to inherit some of my grandma's costume jewelry, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Grandpa, you got scammed. You spent way too much money on that for it to not be real diamonds. Come on. But as marriage being the only, back to it. But if as marriage being the only economic vehicle, it is the dependent on the success of your partner, which is basically taking part of the primary method of financial advancement. There's also the happiest place mirror, which analysis of writing it for Daco C note how Disney popularized the narrative, masking systems inequality behind the cheery veneer of romantic fulfillment. And through the veneer of romantic fulfillment, Disney was able to kind of snub under the rug of masking systematic inequalities that actually affect women and that rag to riches story. And I think that's really interesting to talk about how Disney is such a powerful company that they don't just control what we see, they also control what we don't see and what we don't watch, which is, I think, an interesting topic for another time. But when it comes to that post-World War II cultural alignment, we saw, as in The Atlantic, how it highlights how the 1950s Disney release perfectly captured the post-war desire to trade wartime trauma to suburban consumer comfort. It's the domestic reality. It validates the idea that a woman's ultimate achievement was not a career, but managing a beautiful, comfortable home. At least according to what? According to who? According to who? According to who? Because if Rosie the Riveter was forced to go and pop out kids unmedicated and make her husband a martini, I don't think she would have lasted very long. She got those muscles. She'd be it's just, you know. But, to be so honest, Cinderella is no longer a good representation of the American dream because her narrative relies on passive submission, external resolution, and the maternal independence, which is not acted on, which sharply contradicts modern values of self determination, financial independence, and systematic critiquing of what the American dream is in reality for people now. We think about passive rescue versus active agency, waiting over acting, reliance on magic. This goes into the manifestation where people feel like Cinderella didn't put in the work. She put in, though, the karma. I think she had really good karma. She hustled a little, and she had, well, barely hustled. She was trapped at home. But she had generally okay self-advocacy, as we've seen in other renditions of Cinderella, say, like the one with Hilary Duff, Cinderella Story, if you catch my drift. Loved that movie. No, I think that was with Lizzie McGuire. You know what I mean. But basically, it's the bypassing of the realistic economic efforts and careers that are building and celebrating today. And I feel like this is why I feel like Cinderella is not the representation of the rags to riches story as much as we hoped, because she didn't collect, she didn't hustle, she didn't like do this big demanding thing. She just collected karma. When I see the word karma, or I think of the word karma, I think of the song I Say No from Heather's the Musical, because she's like, starting now, I'll pay back all the karma. I edited that out because I know that you would instantly click off if you would hear me saying. But we also talk about how marriage is no longer the ultimate career goal. We are still conditioned as women to see marriage and children as the ultimate life goal. Like, this is the thing that makes your life worth living, to prosper and to reproduce your bad genes. Sorry, that's kind of gross, but I'm just coming at this through the perspective of someone with really bad ADHD and a lot of childhood trauma, where I think of epigenetics a lot, in the sense of like, I have to be really careful, because even if I try so hard not to, I will accidentally pass down my trauma to my offsprings, and that's something I want to be wary of. But yeah, that sounded weird originally without the context. Basically, now with financial autonomy and the need to be dependent on your partner, it can also allow for what I believe is financial abuse. Like, that's what people forget. Like, financial abuse is a real thing if you're like reliant financially on your partner, where the story implies that women's values are validated only by choosing a powerful man figure, or at least being chosen by a powerful male figure. Directly clashes with modern feministic ideas of self-sufficiency and independent financial security. But there's also this cruel optimistic ignorance to barriers, where we have the meritocracy myth, where the fable suggests that if an oppressive person is simply sweet, quiet, and well-behaved, their suffering will naturally end. And the systematic blindness to poverty and institutionalized racism and rigid class barriers that actually keep people from mobilizing up the social and economic ladder. It is an outdated standard of worth that does not just exclude women from the narrative of what we think, but also excludes women of color, women of disabilities, women from different social economic backgrounds, women who grew up in poverty, etc. It's just kind of like not meeting the vibrational energy. Online influencers represent a hyper monetized algorithmic version of what the American dream is, and pivots away from traditional 9-to-5 capitalism, while remaining deeply embedded in consumerism. For younger generations facing declining economic mobility and soaring student debt, influencing has replaced traditional prestigious careers like medicine or law, and is the ultimate now aspiring goal for younger people. The pivot from traditional careers comes from the staled mobility, where now we're seeing a rise of narrow, leading 50% of young Americans into influencing as a viable escape from economic uncertainty. Because now we no longer have promises that the college education will get us a job. goes beyond that. We have no promise that just because we're getting an internship, that's gonna turn into a job, and we have no promise that that job will lead to a promotion, and we'll have no promises that this job or this straight line pathway would lead to success. We have been given up on that promise that people have been saying. Now, with influencing, you basically get to monetize your leisurely activities. You get to be creative. You get to work at home. Big tech companies have successfully recast everyday social media labor as an edible way to monetize this leisure. And there's not as much gatekeeping as people think. Unlike corporate structures or elite institutions, influencers' success is determined by immediate market value and audience resonance rather than big systematic barriers. So now we're seeing a new perspective of how we are marketable. What brand are we developing? And we are starting to see our new intrinsic worth as a consumer, but also as a product. Now we are practicing the mode of feeling safe being seen, and how not being chosen by a powerful person, but rather being distributed amongst the people, in the sense where the power of feeling safe being seen and power of attention and fame is being held by public accord. It's democratizing fame, which I love. And we're seeing this hyper materialism that's being disguised as freedom, where it's Christmas every day, and it's basically just the escapism of voyeurism, where audience consume lifestyle vlogs and beauty and comfortable homes as a form of relief from their own financial stress, where the algorithmic capabilities show that James Trudeau Adams argued that individuals to achieve their fullest innate structure or stature. Controversially, modern influencer culture demands that creators abandon personal intuition to serve and follow the audience, which I would argue that good authenticity, as someone who's worked in marketing for as some the girly pops that are just listening to this episode on Spotify, Substack, etc. If you want to know what was going on in the context of why I was like, whoa, it was actually because I was showing off my feet accidentally because I was sockless, and I had to blur it out because when you work in social media marketing, you also know what the internet is like sometimes. And I'm not giving those away for free. Sorry. Someone who has worked in marketing for quite some time, confidently I can say that I politely do not agree with that. And I think that you have to make content that people want to see, but you also need to know who you are and know why people are following you, why people are watching you. And it's not just to make fun of you online, BT dubs. Sometimes it's just other stuff. But the noble lie of accessibility is what's really, really captivating, where we have the illusion of the democratic win, where influencing represents a still false meritocracy, where anyone can achieve wealth and work hard enough. But in reality, we are all systemically ingrained with this bad karma, in the sense where I feel like that influencing, is oversaturated, but people can still make it, just not to the same degree. And there are still many systematic barriers, especially in the beauty space, that keep people from getting that win. So it is definitely not a perfect world, sadly. But we see that it still mimics classic rags to riches stories, underdog narratives, and only a tiny fraction of creators achieve luxury, while leaving the vast majority trapped in unpaid digital labor. Because let's face it, if you really think about it, a lot of influencers go poor trying to be an influencer. Like, influencers have the ability to be poor, and they won't share that online. Isn't that interesting? In the end, it's the paradox of feeling visibly safe. Is only feeling safe from abuse when hidden at home or completely disguised at a ball. While the old safety meant private home ownership, new safety means public financial independence, where the modern influencer has true safety is found by controlling the narrative through their screens. While the shared thread is to feel safe being seen, but being seen on your own terms, while also having other people in your life, even important people, still know your exact worth. And that's what we need. We need people to see our worth beyond what we can do for them. Because if you're exhausted all the time and you're like doing so many things, I'm a firm believer it's because everyone wants a piece of you. Everyone wants something from you. So to have someone find you and see your inherent worth before you have to prove anything, that I think is the proponent of the fame and fortune aspect of the American dream. Where with the old American dream, it talked about hard labor in a factory or office and guaranteed upward mobility. But since those guarantees of upward mobility do not exist anymore, now we're seeing people go to unconventional and sometimes artistic ways to make a living, hence influencing, where your mobility upwards is completely up to your devices, and I think good karma. But it all promotes the idea that ordinary people can still be chosen for greatness, showing that influencing and the common aspects of the American dream are still heavily intertwined. Overall, if I had to make my final remarks, I would say comfortably and confidently that not just you are loved, you are special, you are gorgeous, but you are fully capable and worthy of success. And I think that you should not let anything stop you from getting the life you want, because audacity is the main thing and good karma is the main thing that I feel like will get you far. Not a fancy dress, not anything like that. Because if you notice in my article on Substack, I talk about, I think it was enclosed cognition, where Cinderella did not need to look beautiful to feel beautiful. She needed to turn herself inside out and authentically reach nirvana, in the sense where she got to finally represent outwardly how she felt about herself inwardly, showing that confidence and a really good concept of self-identity and self-worth and knowing who you are as a person is, I feel like, an intrinsic need in order to succeed, not just in this economy, but in order to live a happy life successfully or not, whether you define success as material goods or not. And of course, if you love this episode, you're watching on YouTube or you're listening to it on Spotify, I would love it if you consider subscribing to the Substack Vanity Thoughts, where we talk about beauty and popular culture and storytelling as a whole, so we can get the chronically online divas to live their best life on and offline. I am your host, Mila Duffy, and this was basically Vanity Thoughts, and I hope you all have a fabulous day. And don't forget, please, for free, consider subscribing to the Substack for weekly watches, reads, and listens for your daily dose of a divalicious internet. And of course, look into a few other things, like maybe consider buying myself a coffee monthly, and you'll get access to exclusive podcast episodes, the full archive of video essays, podcast episodes, and also written works and essays past 30 days, because there's a lot. I'm almost at 100 posts on Substack, which means that you will have a little under 100 podcast episodes, video essays, deep dive essays that will be available at your fingertips for a good read. That's going to be roughly, I believe, like 3 days worth of good reading content. And this podcast episode will be the 100th post on Substack. So if you want the full unedited version, vibes, check out my Substack, link below. And I hope to see you on the stack. And I hope you have a fabulous day. Bye, divas!